We are going to dive into discussion about what studio Microsoft could purchase next. This is part 2 of the acquisition series, so let's get into it. Hello guys, welcome to another episode of 3-Bit Talks, a part of the VGHD show. I'm 3-Bit and this is part 2 of what companies Microsoft could potentially purchase. If you guys want to see part 1 where we break it down between private companies versus public companies, be sure to check that out here. This video will definitely be more conversational than the last one, so keep that in mind when watching this. If you guys like videos like this, be sure to ring that notification bell to be notified when our next video hits. You guys have been killing it lately and it really helps and motivates me and the VGHT cast to keep making these types of videos. They take a ton of research and effort in addition to the VGHT podcast we try and do weekly. So thank you guys so much for the support. It really means a lot. With that being said, let's talk about it. So what's the overview of part 1? Well, in the last video, we discussed the differences between public companies versus private companies and how Microsoft is more likely to acquire a private company due to their history of acquisitions. Private companies are a lot easier to acquire, and by purchasing a private company, you don't have to answer to public shareholders or announce it to the public. This led to me arguing over what private companies Microsoft could acquire, and essentially it came down to Valve for the private company and Capcom for the public company. We also discussed the different ways you can take over a public company, one being a hostile takeover and then there's the friendly one, and that was pretty much the overview of the previous video. However, with that in mind, I've been getting a lot of comments about potential studios, and it made me rethink some of my arguments and made me solidify other parts of my arguments. This video will be me going to further detail on things I might have missed in the first part, and again, this video is just for fun before the consoles come out. Take what I say with a grain of salt, but I will do my best to make an educated guess based on acquisition laws and the history between Microsoft and the possible acquired studio. So based on the previous video, let's put Capcom and Valve on the throne for the big companies. But what if my source is wrong about it being a bigger acquisition than Bethesda? A big portion of my video was basing it on that source. Well, if it was a smaller studio, that would raise other companies in the spotlight for being purchased, such as Techland, Bloober Team, Asobo, Bluepoint Games, it goes on and on. When getting to the topic of smaller studios, you should consider the history of what games has that studio produced and how much it would fit for Microsoft. I believe out of this list of smaller studios, Techland is a pretty good developer for Xbox to acquire. We haven't really heard much from the developer lately. The last game that was released from them was the first Dying Light game released back in 2015. They did have some updated DLC content, but it's been a while. But guess what? They are a private company and they're from Poland. Additionally, it was rumored that Phil Spencer went to Poland with the purpose of buying a studio, which brings also Bloober Team into the conversation. Something to consider is Techland did deny these rumors about an acquisition back in May of this year. Once the conversation started to pick up, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. They could be lying about it. I mean, there's no laws stating that they have to tell the truth about these things. Additionally, I think it's been enough time that many people may have forgotten about the possibility of Techland being acquired. Rumors can be a very bad thing for business deals. Why, you may ask? Well, if rumors of a studio being acquired goes around to the public, it raises the cost of premiums, which means it would cost Microsoft even more to acquire them if the public knew about it. People knowing about an acquisition adds additional value to the studio, especially when a big company like Microsoft wants to acquire them. It also raises the bargaining price for the owners of that business so that Microsoft wouldn't back out of that deal due to public pressure. So just by people knowing about an acquisition can raise the cost. Let's say Techland is worth 300 million because it is a smaller studio. So let's say it's worth 300 million. That can go up to 600 million due to the cost of premiums. However, it is fair to say there are laws about this, and you never really purchase a studio for how much it's worth to begin with. You take into account of the additional price added above the worth and the ownership of the company's IPs. If the IP can make a good amount of money, the cost is raised because you can make your money back if the game is great, right? So Techland possibly being acquired could explain the constant game delays. The original Dying Light 2 was supposed to release back in 2019. We're now headed towards 2021 without any even peep of an announcement. Dying Light 2 was slated for a 2020 release, and it's now being delayed indefinitely. It can be brought into conversation that perhaps they're structuring those games underneath the Xbox family. Very possible, and again, I'm taking out my source that it is a bigger studio than Bethesda and thinking about other possibilities here. There's been more recent rumors circulating about Microsoft asking Japanese developers if they can purchase their studio. Now, I mentioned Sega in the past, and if you want to know a little bit about that, I talk about that in part 1. But this whole thing kind of solidifies the point I made in the previous video, where Phil wants that Japanese developer. He traveled to Japan multiple times, talked about how he's disappointed in Xbox for not having a good enough presence in Japan. So it does jump up to the priority list on what studio that could be. So yeah, let's discuss Japanese developers. Capcom and Valve are locked on my throne, but what Japanese developers are worthwhile for investment? FromSoftware is one I'll be adding to the conversation, and I know you're thinking FromSoftware is like a Sony thing, right? And as this video goes on, you'll notice a pattern of me bringing up a studio and either confirming or shutting down why that studio might go through. FromSoftware is interesting. Why? Well, for one, remember Bandai Namco. Well, they are actually one of the primary shareholders of the company, and back in 2014 Kadokawa Publishing purchased FromSoftware. So when you want to ask if Microsoft is willing to purchase FromSoftware, the real question is, are they willing to buy out Kadokawa Publishing? That's when relationship between FromSoftware and Microsoft does come into play. You also have to consider Japanese laws. Can an American company acquire a Japanese company? And the answer is yes. Yes, they can. But it's also easier for Microsoft because over the years they have built this Xbox presence by building Xbox Japan division for this very reason. And while it is true that Japan has limited foreign ownership of companies, that is primarily restricted to the 12 industries, which is nuclear power, gas, paper. So Japan isn't limiting foreign ownership for video game publishers, or in this case, Kadokawa Publishing, which extends out of video games into the manga market as well. So what is the relationship between FromSoftware and Microsoft? Well, we know FromSoftware has several exclusive titles on PlayStation, and the relationship between them is pretty great. You have two Japanese studios working together, being Sony and FromSoftware. And I think it's important to note that out of these big three studios, Microsoft, Nintendo, and Sony, Microsoft is the only American company out of the big three. I think many people forget that FromSoftware's latest biggest game, and if we're talking in terms of relationship, FromSoftware's latest biggest game, Elden Ring, was premiered on the Xbox stage in E3 2019, just last year. And the fact that Bloodborne was a risk for them, if it wasn't for Sony stepping in to help, any troubles FromSoftware has or seems to have stem not from development, but from development costs. And it's safe to say Microsoft has the finances more than Sony, and this could be the slot Phil Spencer is looking for in terms of buying a Japanese studio, but who knows? While I had some pretty decent arguments for Microsoft acquiring Capcom and Valve, it's time to argue against myself from the previous video. Some people mention the company Koei Tecmo and how it is still possible for Microsoft to acquire them. While I do believe it is a company I might have threw out too quickly, it does fall under the publicly shared company bracket, which again is a lot harder to deal with public companies. I'm only re-bringing them up because of Phil Spencer wanting to purchase a Japanese studio, all these new rumors about Japanese studios. So my main reason for Microsoft, why they wouldn't acquire Koei Tecmo, was actually Nintendo. Remember that? So they purchased 3.8 million shares worth in the company, which values to around $184 million. So I tossed them aside because of that. However, what I really didn't consider is how small of a percentage that actually is. If you were to round up how much Nintendo actually owns or gains in that investment, you get around to 1.64%. So if you think about it in that way, it's really odd that Nintendo even considered investing into that if they weren't going to get much out of it, right? So, I mean, that's something. I would think, when putting up $184 million into a company, what would I get out of that purchase? So Nintendo wouldn't do that if they didn't want to solidify at least some relationship with Koei Tecmo, and I think that purchase can stem on Nintendo's lack of third-party support on their system. But Nintendo's relationship with Koei Tecmo is why I denied them in the last video, but I'll slap them back up for this one. Due to what I just read. So if we wanted to compare a similar situation to the Nintendo and Koei Tecmo purchase, Sony actually did the same thing with Epic Games this year when they purchased $250 million worth in shares. So you might be questioning, how much does Sony now own in Epic Games? Well, Sony now owns a measly 1.64% of Epic Games as well. These deals don't guarantee exclusivity, but it does lead to those deals being more frequent. Sounds like a waste of money to me, but what do I know? It creates better relationships. It doesn't necessarily guarantee anything. Koei Tecmo stays in this regard because it being a Japanese studio, and they have better IP than Epic, and I will explain that further in a bit. But let's stay on Koei Tecmo for now. So Koei Tecmo is a publicly traded company. I explained this in my last video and why it's harder to acquire these, but let's look at it from another angle as well. When you try to acquire a private company like Valve, you cannot buy stock in Valve, right? That is up to publicly traded companies like Microsoft when you deal with the SEC. Right now, if you wanted to own a percentage of Microsoft, you can buy stock, and every few months or so, because you own stock, you get to vote on different decisions from within the company by the law and by the rules that is stated within the company, or you get to basically own a smaller percentage from within that company. And basically to prevent takeovers from within those public companies, board members and CEOs maintain a large percentage of the stock, something that is quite off-putting by public companies, besides the fact that you have to answer to different shareholders rather than just buy them following acquisition regulation with private companies. Private companies do not have to answer to shareholders and investors, which again is why Microsoft and other businesses love acquiring private companies. I'll say this repeatedly because of how important that is to note when talking about Microsoft buying out studios. So when you look at what studios Microsoft will acquire, research if they are a private company. But you also have to consider that Microsoft is very rich, and if that company is worth it, they will buy it. What company am I adding to the Valve, Capcom, and now I'll add Koei Tecmo and FromSoftware? Well, I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention WB. And a lot of people was asking why I didn't include them or Epic Games. Why did I not include them? Well, what do we publicly know about WB Games? Well, we know that WB considered to put their game division up for sale this year, and that huge companies like Google and Amazon was in the running for acquiring them, as well as Microsoft. Microsoft was in the running. They really was interested in buying the game division for WB. The WB division owns studios like Rocksteady, NetherRealm, and Monolith Productions. That is games like Mortal Kombat, Batman Arkham Knight, the Harry Potter games, and the Lord of the Rings games. It's an extreme negative for me that this deal did not actually mean Microsoft getting the IPs for Batman. It means they would get the studios that develops Batman, but not the IP. This did exclude Mortal Kombat. However, the other games are just licensed out to those developers. So Microsoft was still ready to play ball in this because these developers are super talented, and maybe somewhere down the line you would get these IP deals. And they were obviously ready to acquire them. So why didn't they? Well, it seems like once all of the other companies start to pour in with their interests, WB realized the actual value for their game division, and then WB pulled out of being purchased. And I thought it was weird that they were willing to go on to be purchased in the first place, because they were actually pretty financially great. Like Mortal Kombat constantly went on the charts of being a successful game. But you also have to bring up that WB itself has some debts. So they're off the table for now. Well, Squeaky Bit, WB is in some debt. They're in the negative, which is why they considered selling in the first place. If they do not make the targeted projections that they're possibly thinking of with these new upcoming games, which is the Suicide Squad game, the Harry Potter RPG, and Gotham Knights, well, it's possible they go back on sale. So they are off for now, but I could see them going back up if those games don't sell particularly well. I personally don't see Suicide Squad and Gotham Knights selling extravagantly. I can, however, see the Harry Potter RPG selling pretty well. And yeah, I'm actually really looking forward to that one. So that is why WB is not on my list, but they're not completely off either. So save it for my 2021 acquisitions video. So there's two more studios I will discuss before I end it off, and that is Epic and CD Projekt Red. Alright, look. CD Projekt Red does not own much IP. They have many talented developers that license the IPs for their games, similar to what we just talked about with the WB deal. They don't technically own the Witcher IP, which is based off of the book by, this guy. And they technically don't own the Cyberpunk IP, which is based off of Mike Pondsmith's board game walk. So what does that leave Microsoft with? Well, it leaves them with an extremely talented Polish studio, possibly their engine work and all this different stuff. But what is the goal for Microsoft acquiring studios? The goal is pumping out content for Game Pass, and CD Projekt Red does not fit that criteria necessarily, in my opinion. Not to mention the fact that CD Projekt Red is very close with the Polish government, as we mentioned before. They fuel the economy over there. So again, no CD Projekt Red. But why did I exclude Epic Games in the acquisition list? Well, it's for the reason I stage Epic and CD Projekt Red together. Little IP. Epic Games' current focus in terms of game development right now is Fortnite, which is arguably one of the biggest games right now. But what would be the purpose of acquiring that multi-platform title? I'm aware they own other IPs, such as Bulletstorm and the Unreal Tournament series, but I wouldn't say the asking price is worth buying Epic for. If I was Phil, and I even questioned buying Epic Games, it would not be because of Fortnite or the IP they maintain. It would be because of their amazing engine, the Unreal Engine. Most of Microsoft's first-party titles, first-party studios, are using Unreal Engine for their games because it's an amazing engine. But then you ask, why purchase Epic for their engine if they can just use the engine right now without acquiring them? The only argument you could possibly make about that is to make profit off of others using the engine, but you'd have to see if that was even worth it in the long run. I personally don't think it is. Again, take everything I say with a grain of salt. They could announce tomorrow that they are purchasing all the studios I said they wouldn't. I'm just making educated guesses here. So it is important to at least mention that Epic Games And Microsoft did have a relationship in the past, with Epic Games being the original developers of the Gears of War franchise, which is now being developed by the Coalition. So let's conclude. We know Phil Spencer wants a Japanese-based studio, preferably privately owned based on the history of purchases from within Microsoft. And on top of that, the studio they purchased has to sort of fit the brand of Game Pass, which basically is quarterly but quality content, right? If it's privately owned, it's more likely on my list. And if it is publicly owned, it is less likely on my list. Another company I want to sort of bring back is Ubisoft, because Microsoft has been very buddy-buddy with them. And lately, nobody can deny the amount of content they would bring to the Xbox ecosystem. Only really took them out because of the fact that they're public, and I was arguing with there being a subset of studios Microsoft would purchase, but I'll add them back for the sake of arguments. Also, totally unrelated, but I'm pretty sure they're going to show Hellblade 2 at the Game Awards. I had a couple sources tell me that in private messages, and I didn't know where to put it, so I'm putting it here. So this will probably be my last video on the topic for a while. There's a lot of videos coming up, such as my Series X versus PlayStation 5 review, so look out for that. So did you guys agree with this video or not? Let us know in the comment section down below. Don't forget to subscribe for more content from the Video Games HD. I'm 3-Bit, signing off. Have a good one.